Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 410. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about temples and wreck dives and Komodo dragons as we go to Indonesia and the island of Komodo.
One more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have two news stories for you. United has announced that they're going to be more strictly enforcing their rules on carry-on luggage. Their rules are that a bag can be no larger than 9 inches by 14 inches by 22 inches, and they will be putting different bag measuring devices at every gate is the plan. Now, they're a little bit softies there because it turns out that the measuring bin is actually 1 inch larger in all the dimensions. But still, if you have a bag larger than that, it will have to be checked. But one thing you can't check a bag for, a strange story is coming out that may or may not have happened, but there's a story that the TSA demanded to inspect somebody's bag for Bitcoin. Now, if you know what Bitcoin is, it's an electronic or digital currency, meaning that it's not like cash and you're not going to find it in someone's bag. The TSA has been unable to verify the incident. For links to both those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. The Amateur Traveler is once again sponsoring this episode, and I want you to think about credit cards, and I want to tell you a story. I was just in the Dusseldorf train station, and I went to buy a train ticket, and I presented my credit card, and it has no chip on it, and they couldn't take it at the kiosk, which did not surprise me. But even when I went to the person, she said, I cannot use this card. You're going to have to pay cash. So if you're traveling to Europe, it's becoming increasingly a problem to not have a chip with a smart PIN, and mine doesn't. So I may have to change credit cards yet again. But if you're interested in a new travel credit card, check out amateurtraveler.com/credit card. I'd like to welcome back to the show Chris Willis from Atlanta, who's come to talk to us about a trip to Indonesia. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here again.
And I reached out to Chris because I just hadn't heard his voice recently enough. Chris has been on the show, we think, about half a dozen times, including a couple of our most memorable episodes, including going to Tonga and swimming with whales, and going to Vanuatu, which is, I think, the last time you were on, Chris, as well as going and taking pictures of wild horses in Mongolia and mountain gorillas in Africa. And you've got another wildlife and photography related trip for us here this time, I believe.
Sure. Well, this was one that was really special to me because the main objective of the trip was to get over to Indonesia to take pictures of Komodo dragons in the wild.
Excellent. Now, it's not quite as simple as that you just take a flight right from here and then go see Komodo dragons.
No, it's not that easy to get to. First, you have to get sort of in the vicinity. Komodo dragons only live on 2 or maybe 3 islands in Indonesia, and those islands don't happen to be near any place that has an international airport. So you've got to get to Bali first, which of course usually requires making a connection somewhere. I happen to connect through Hong Kong. Then once you're on Bali, you have to get on a boat and sail for 3 or 3.5 days to get there. So that's the sort of path that you have to take in order to see the Komodo dragons in the wild.
Excellent. And since you went through Bali, now we have done another show on Bali a while back, but you had some experiences there that I want to cover before we move on to your journey from there. But Bali wasn't your favorite spot.
Well, my style of travel is really wanting to get away from large masses of tourists. I don't like sort of mass market tourism. I don't like places that are heavily crowded. And to me, the parts of it that I saw, with some exceptions, were very urbanized, and the sort of urban aspect of the island went sort of on and on. There were places that were very touristy, seemed to cater mostly to Australian tourists since we were over in that part of the world. Mm-hmm. Lots of Western shops, lots of big beach hotels, things like that. And you don't have sort of an idea of being in a secluded tropical paradise. And when I'd thought of Bali before going there, I'd always envisioned that. And I'm sure there are some parts of the island that do fit that description. And I saw some of them on one of my day trips there, but the main places that are inhabited by tourists seem to be a little too touristy for my taste.
But you did have some good experiences there. Why don't we cover some of those, and then we'll get on a boat?
Sure. Well, I took a day trip to go diving while I was there, and one of the things that was nice was just the drive up to the place where I was diving was very nice because it got me out of the main city and the main tourist areas, driving along the coastline in some very nice rustic villages, very scenic. The place that I went is called Tulamben Bay, which is on the northeast side of Bali, and it stands sort of in the shadow of the largest volcano on Bali. And so I saw the volcano along the way and ended up in a sort of small beach resort town on the northeast side of Bali and did 4 dives in one day, which is actually a record for me. I've never done that many in one day. 3 of the 4 dives were on a shipwreck called the Liberty, which is a World War II shipwreck that's there in Tulamben Bay in Bali.
And you mentioned one moment that I'd love you to recount again.
Sure, yes, of course. Well, I mean, the shipwreck itself has an interesting story behind it. It's a World War II transport vessel, an American one, and it was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine while it was en route somewhere. And the ship wasn't sunk. It was actually towed into Bali for salvage, and they towed it in and beached it on the beach in Tulamben Bay. And it actually sat there on the beach for about 20 years. And then in the mid-1960s, that large volcano that I told you about, the largest one on Bali, erupted and created a big earthquake. The force of the earthquake actually rolled the ship off the beach, and it rolled down into the water, and now it's on its side, sort of parallel with the beach, maybe 150 or 200 feet off the beach. So it's broken up pretty well now. And it's a wreck that you can do at all skill levels because the wreck starts at 35 or 40 feet and the bottom of it is about 90, something like that. So I dove it twice during the day and once at night. The day dives were great. There's lots of places to swim through, lots of fish and things to see. But the most memorable aspect of it was diving it at night because we went down, my guide and I went down into the wreck, and one of the real attractions there is the remnants of the cargo hold are the home to a school of what are called flashlight fish, which are bioluminescent fish. So you make your way down to the cargo hold, and I don't remember exactly what depth it is. It's 60 or 70 feet, something like that. But you get down there and flip your lights off, so you're in complete and total darkness. And then you find yourself surrounded by these little spots of light that are going all around you. And those are the bioluminescent patches on the flashlight fish. And it was really quite magical to have sort of these bioluminescent animals moving around you in complete darkness. I felt like I was in a Discovery Channel special or something. It was really a cool experience.
Excellent. Anything else we want to cover on Bali before we get on a boat here?
So on the south side of Bali, there's a pretty famous temple called Tanah Lot. That's a big Hindu temple. Bali is distinctive from the rest of Indonesia. Mm-hmm. Indonesia is primarily a Muslim country, but in Bali, it's majority Hindu. And Tanah Lot is a temple on the south side of the island that a lot of tourists go to see. And you can watch the sunset from there, and it's very scenic. They have demonstrations of dances and other things that are there. From a nature standpoint, though, one of the really interesting things is right by the ocean, sort of in the rocks, right by the beach, there's this cave. And every night at sundown, I don't know how many, but it seems like hundreds of thousands of bats come streaming out of this cave. And so if you position yourself right, you can see these bats just come flying out of the cave, just a stream of them. And it's an incredible sight to see. And it was a little bit funny, too, because there were two Western tourists who were down on the beach when the bats started sort of issuing forth from this cave. And it was really hilarious to sort of see them look around and figure out where the noise was coming from, and then see this giant river of bats coming out of this cave that was right next to them. And then once the bats come out, they sort of start circling around in the immediate vicinity. It seems like sort of the largest flock of birds you've ever seen, but it's really all bats. And you can hear them chirping, and then they sort of fly off and go wherever they're going to go to catch food. But seeing that many bats come out of a cave was really something special and added a lot to the cultural experience of seeing the temple.
I'm not sure my wife and daughter would quite enjoy that experience, I think, as much as you did.
Well, there were lots of women in our group, and they liked it just as much as I did.
Okay. Just experiencing, I remember seeing the flying foxes in Sydney, Australia, and they were not taken with that majestic animal, let's just say.
Sure. These are not nearly so big as flying foxes, much smaller bats, but they don't really get that close to you, so I'm not sure they're that scary.
Excellent. And then you had another one, which was the monkey forest.
Sure. There's a town on Bali called Ubud, which was made famous by the movie Eat, Pray, Love, because the book was based there in part. So lots of tourists go there. And near Ubud, there's a monkey forest. And essentially, the forest is a very accessible place where there are a large number of Balinese long-tailed macaques living in the forest that have been basically habituated and domesticated. And so tourists go in, they're laying all over the place and running all over the place. People feed them, and you can get right up close to them and see the monkeys. And they're regarded as sort of a sacred animal there. And there's temples sort of with monkey figurines all around them. And you can see that as a tourist attraction. The real issue there is that some tourists get a little too free with the monkeys and will start to feed them and try to like have the monkeys get on their shoulder and pose for pictures and things like that. And the problem is they've completely lost their fear of people, so they can actually become quite aggressive if you don't give them their way. So we actually witnessed a tourist who was trying to get a picture with a monkey sitting on her shoulder, and she had a piece of a banana, and she was sort of holding it where the monkey couldn't get it and teasing the monkey with it so that he'd stay in place on her shoulder. And eventually the monkey got kind of irritated and impatient with it and started hitting her in the face, pretty violently, I have to say. I don't think she was seriously injured, but it was certainly a rude shock to get slapped in the face by a monkey. But we saw that happen right in front of our eyes.
I think this is how Planet of the Apes started, as I recall, but I could be mistaken about that.
Quite an uprising. So it just sort of goes to show you what kind of weird behavior you can get from animals when they get habituated and domesticated to people and get used to being fed by people, which these particular ones are.
Right. Although the only behavior there that's hard to understand is the tourist, actually. So now, before we get you on a boat here, how did you arrange the ship? How did you figure out how to get to see the Komodo dragons?
Well, the whole thing was a prepackaged tour through an American company called International Expeditions, who we've traveled with before. So we just bought a prepackaged tour.
And what other tours had you done with them before?
We did one in Peru where they had set up a guide for us in the Cusco, Machu Picchu area. And then they have a series of Amazon River cruise boats that they book on. And we had done that trip in 2003, as I recall.
Okay, excellent. So tell me a little more about the experience. First of all, just the boat experience up until the point that you're going to see the Komodo dragons.
Sure. Well, so the boat leaves from Bali, and the boat itself holds a maximum, I think, of 24 passengers. So it's my kind of cruise. I don't like ships with thousands of people on it, but about 20 is perfect for me. The ship is made as sort of an Indonesian style of an Indonesian sailing vessel, although it operates primarily under motor power. But it has this very sort of distinctive Indonesian style to it. And it does have sails that they can put up for show if they want to, but it's primarily a motor yacht. It works part of the year as a dive boat, actually, and as a liveaboard dive boat. And they do diving trips out in the islands east of Bali. And when we get to talking about that area, you'll understand why. But for our trip, it wasn't a dive trip. It was just our mode of transport out from Bali to Komodo and back. And the boat was really very nice, very comfortable. It didn't have all the activities, of course, of a big cruise ship, but also didn't have the crowds.
And you're not dressing for dinner either.
No, certainly not. Just shorts and T-shirts every day.
And Indonesia is how many different islands?
More than I know of, but it's got to be at least hundreds and maybe thousands. But we were making stops twice a day usually. So we would visit an island and maybe visit a village or do something else during part of a day. And then there'd always be a place to stop and snorkel on some of the reefs that are on those islands. So we visited some islands like Moyo and Lombok and Sumbawa, and then Komodo and Rinca and Satanda, I think, were the ones that we went to. And each of them has a village or some other attraction on it, but they also have these incredible coral reefs. And so we did lots of snorkeling. We did snorkeling at least once a day, sometimes twice a day along the way. And that was honestly really one of the highlights of the trip, because I've been snorkeling and diving in a lot of different places in the world. And as you move east from Bali and get into some of those islands, you have some of the most incredible reefs in terms of the color and the density of the coral, the amount of animals. You see some sort of Pacific staples like banded sea snakes. We saw several of those, lots of different reef fish. But I had a really memorable first actually on one of those snorkeling expeditions in that I saw my very first cuttlefish. I've never seen cuttlefish in the wild before. And I was lucky to find two of them in very shallow water, like maybe 8 feet of water or something like that, sort of tending their eggs in a coral head. The thing that makes cuttlefish so fascinating is their ability to change the color and texture of their skin so quickly. And so as these two cuttlefish would move over the coral head and then move back over a rock, they would sort of instantaneously be changing the color and texture of their skin to match whatever they were up against. And I got a chance to watch them for a good 20 or 30 minutes and just really enjoyed that a lot, because I think the cuttlefish is one of the coolest marine animals that there is. And I'd never had the chance to see one before I was snorkeling over in Indonesia.
And as you went further away from Bali and further away from where more people go, does the character of the islands change significantly? Or once you get one island away, it's the same as getting 3 days away?
Well, each of them has their own character about them. But of course, the thing you notice immediately is you move away from a predominantly Hindu island into what's true for most of Indonesia, and it's predominantly Muslim. So you see sort of signs of that everywhere when you're not in Bali. But certainly once you get away from the immediate vicinity of Bali, the villages are not that touristy. It's not that densely populated, and each one has its own sort of interesting charm to it. So one of the villages that we visited is a place historically where ships have been built. And so they're built by hand and over a period of many months, I think. And there were several ships sort of in mid-construction while we were there, and they were sort of partially hauled out onto the beach. And you got to see the people actually working on building the ships in the traditional Indonesian style. So that was really interesting. And some of the other villages were fishing villages or things like that. And then some of the islands we stopped at weren't villages at all. Like Satanda, for example, they were planning to build a tourist resort there, but there wasn't much there when we visited, except a trail where you could hike to the top of an extinct volcano that has a big crater lake in the middle of it. And it's sort of a moderately hard hike. Not everybody from the trip made it up there. But once you did make it up there, you were treated to these spectacular views, not just of the crater lake, but also of the surrounding ocean and, of course, our ship that was parked in the harbor. And so there were plenty of things to do that weren't, strictly speaking, villages, like the crater lake, for example.
And I'm picturing white sand beaches, blue-green water. Do I have the right mental image? Palm trees?
Yes, for sure. All of that.
Okay.
And it was really quite beautiful. And as I said, the coral, the reefs, the fish, the eels and turtles and cuttlefish and all the things that we saw, I mean, honestly, it was some of the best reefs I've ever seen. And it really made me sick that I wasn't diving on that part of the trip. It wasn't a dive trip, so they didn't have gear on board.
Oh, okay.
So I couldn't do any diving between Bali and Komodo, but I was really, really wishing that I was. And there were a couple of liveaboards near us most of the time. And they were sitting there doing dives day and night all around us. And it made me really jealous, I have to tell you.
And I'm curious if you know the answer to this, because you tend to do very good research, which is one of the reasons I love having you on the show. If you were to go back and do that same boat as a dive boat, would it be around the same price as going on an excursion, or is it less expensive? Or
I imagine it would be about the same.
Okay.
I didn't price it because I haven't looked at what a dive trip there would cost. But just guessing, I would guess that it would be about the same, because you wouldn't be having all the land excursions, other than the liveaboards do tend to go to Komodo and go on land just to see Komodo dragons, because we saw several of them there also, but they're not making all the village visits and things.
Sure,
they're too busy
that makes
diving.
sense.
So my guess is it would be about the same. And they were doing, as I said, both day and night dives. I remember near Komodo, we had a beach barbecue one night. And so the boat set up a really, really nice barbecue on the beach. They had music and everything. It was really very nice. And two of the liveaboards were doing night dives right off the beach. And so you could see the lights of the divers down in the water, which was distracting me from the barbecue and making me want to dive, even though I couldn't.
Excellent. And then you get to the islands with the Komodo dragons on them.
Sure. So they live only on just 2 or 3 islands, Komodo, Rincha, and maybe one other small one. But there's really not that many of them. They're a pretty endangered species. And the islands where they live are all part of a national park, Komodo National Park.
Are they inhabited islands? Or I'm picturing something more looks like it's out of the Galapagos at this point.
Well, it's not totally uninhabited because we only landed on Rincha. The place where you land, there's sort of a national park ranger station there. So there's something that looks like a very small village that looks like it's got 30 people living in it or something like that. I do think that some other parts of the islands are actually inhabited by non-park service people, but the place where we were, there was just sort of a little park ranger station with some huts and then trails leading off into the island where you could walk around.
And you've flown halfway across the world, because you're in Atlanta, as I think we mentioned. So you had to fly all the way across the U.S., all the way across most of the Pacific. You've sailed then for 3 more days. Worth it?
I think it was worth it because there's no other place on Earth to do what I just did, in the sense of seeing Komodo dragons in the wild. They aren't anywhere else. So it's one of the rarest, most endangered animals in the world, with only a few hundred of them alive in the wild. And so if you want that experience of seeing them outside of a zoo, there is no other place to go. So, and not only that, but I would say the trip there and back was worth it too, because of the interesting villages and great snorkeling that I was telling you about. So yeah, I would say that it's worth it.
What was the highlight of the whole trip though?
Oh, for sure. It was seeing the Komodo dragons. I mean, we ended up seeing, I want to say roughly a dozen of them. And they ranged in size from little baby ones that were 1.5 feet long and sort of scampering around, trying to stay away from the big ones, all the way to fully grown males that are 9 feet long and weigh 175 pounds, something like that. And you walk around and you get into very close contact with them. The rangers are there with you to keep you at what they consider to be a safe distance. And they have these wooden sticks that have like a Y at the end of them. And so I think theoretically, if the dragon becomes aggressive, which they can be, they're supposed to use that to sort of fend it off and keep it from biting you. Because the problem with Komodo dragons is not only is it a dangerous animal because it's big and it has big claws and sharp teeth, but the thing about Komodo dragons is they harbor these colonies of bacteria in their mouths.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting fact about them that the design of their teeth and their gums is designed so that their teeth is constantly actually injuring their gums and causing them to bleed slightly in their mouth. And the reason for that is it provides a food supply for these swarms of bacteria that live in their mouths. And so in their natural state, they're hunting a variety of large prey. So there's deer, there's water buffalo on the islands where they live. Those animals are really too big for the dragon to overpower in a conventional sense. It only weighs maybe 175 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
But what they'll do is they'll go up and bite the animal that's their prey on the leg or something. And if they're able to break the skin and get some bacteria into the bloodstream of the prey, they then just wait for the infection to set in, follow the animal around for a couple of days, then it dies, and then they eat it. So it's a very interesting adaptation with this mutualistic behavior with the bacteria in their mouths. Mm-hmm. But what that means is if you happen to get bitten by one and you're out in the middle of nowhere, a 3-day sail away from the nearest big city, which would be Denpasar in Bali, as a tourist, I would imagine there's some chance that could be fatal. So there's some element of danger involved in seeing them at close quarters in their natural habitat. And we were getting within 10 feet of them, again, with the rangers right next to us armed with these apparently very effective wooden sticks.
I'm thinking that having somebody armed with more than a wooden stick might make me feel a little more at ease, but interesting.
Well, let me tell you another thing about the sort of scene there when you land. As I told you, there's this little ranger station with a bunch of huts. Mm-hmm. And the Komodo dragons seem to have become somewhat habituated to the people there because there's a number of them that were hanging around the ranger station. And one of the things that was interesting that seems like it would be kind of hazardous if you worked there is the smaller ones, the ones that were medium sized, maybe 5 feet long or something, seemed to have no compunction about climbing up the steps into these huts, which were set up off the ground, and getting inside the inside areas of the huts. So we were walking around. All of a sudden, a Komodo dragon comes out the door of one of these huts and starts walking down the stairs. And I'm sitting there thinking, if you live there and you work there, what do you do when you come home from work at the end of the day and there's a 5-foot-long lizard in your place? How do you get it out? How do you deal with that? And I thought that was actually kind of funny. We even actually got some pictures of them standing on the steps of some of these huts. It's very interesting that you have people living in such close proximity to them. Now, the dragons were never aggressive toward us or any of the people that were around that we saw. And I don't know of any instance in which a tourist has ever been attacked by one. But certainly it is an animal that is capable of attacking and hurting and maybe even killing a person. There was a famous incident in a zoo a few years ago where a celebrity's husband got bitten on the foot by one and lost one of his toes because it went for his foot inside the enclosure where he was visiting it.
Interesting. What was the biggest surprising thing about the experience?
The concentration of the dragons around the ranger station.
Okay.
I spent a good 2 hours hiking the longest trail that they had from that particular landing site, hoping to see them scattered about through the habitat, which that island is sort of a semi-arid, scrubby kind of, but hilly sort of island. Mm-hmm. I was hoping to see them in a purely natural environment. But most of the ones we saw were right in the immediate vicinity of the ranger station, and that surprised me. I thought they'd be more evenly distributed, but for some reason they congregate near that ranger station.
Now, I trust no one is trying to hand feed them or anything like that.
Not that we saw. Certainly no tourists were doing that or allowed to do that. It was never suggested that anybody would do that. Mm-hmm. The animals congregate around where people are living. You have to suspect that maybe they're being fed, but I didn't see that happening.
One warning you would give, besides don't feed the Komodo dragons by hand? Well,
I mean, you have to be prepared to endure a pretty long trip to get there. Sometimes the sea can be rough, so seasickness can be a problem if you're susceptible to that. And then you've got to be in reasonably good physical shape to go hiking around the island because it is quite hilly.
And you mentioned pictures, and one of the reasons I like having Chris on the show is he takes some wonderful pictures. One picture, though, that just captures the whole trip for you. What's the one picture that for you takes you right back to Indonesia?
Sure. Well, I would have to say that we had one particular adult male Komodo dragon that sort of came out of the forest toward us in perfect sunlight and walked toward us. And I got some great pictures of him walking and then sort of plopped down about 10 feet in front of us and just then started looking at us. And so he was a really nice photographic subject. It's my best pictures of the Komodo dragons. And I would have to say those are probably my proudest pictures from the trip because that was really the whole objective of the trip was to get a picture like that. Mm-hmm. And we had one really cooperative dragon. And I think other than that, a couple of the other pictures that I would say would take me back to the trip is There's a really nice sunset picture of the Tanalot Temple. There's a piece of the temple that has a little building on it that's on a piece of rock that has an arch under it because it's over the water, and the water's carved out an arch under it. And I have a really nice sunset picture behind that. And that really, to me, was one of the best images from the trip. Mm-hmm. And then there's a couple of pictures that I took while diving on the Liberty. And one of them shows this huge school of fish sort of swimming in and out between the ribs of the ship. As I said, the ship is pretty broken up now, but it serves as a home for a lot of marine life, including large schools of fish. And there's this great picture that I took of this huge school of fish sort of swimming in and around the wreck. And that, to me, would probably be the other one that I would say really captures the trip for me.
You've been a lot of different places. How is Indonesia different for you than some of the other places you've been?
Well, I mean, I would say it's really different in a lot of ways. I mean, culturally, you're dealing with either Hindu or Muslim sort of cultures. The culture is different from other islands I've been to, either in the Caribbean or the South Pacific, because ethnically and politically and from a religious standpoint, it's all different. The architecture of Bali and of the other islands in Indonesia is extremely distinct. Mm-hmm. Bali in particular, because of the Hindu influence, you see these sort of Hindu-looking gods and creatures and spirits captured in the stonework and other aspects of buildings everywhere that you go. I don't think I've encountered that anywhere else, so that definitely was very distinct. And again, the other thing was the just incredible vibrancy of the reefs and the really great marine life. Once you got away from Bali, those are less densely populated areas, and the reefs were just so great. And that knocked me over, actually, to see the real quality of the reefs there.
You're 3 days away from the nearest big city. One thing that you said, I'm so glad I packed this, or I really wish I had packed that.
Yeah, I wasn't finding myself wanting anything because, I mean, we were prepared. The tour company had told us what to expect and what to bring, so no problems there. But I didn't view the packing for this trip to be significantly different from any other trip to a tropical island, in the sense that you need your snorkeling gear. Mm-hmm. I always wear a dive skin when I'm snorkeling to protect myself from the sun and from jellyfish. Indo-Pacific waters have much more in the way of jellyfish than you find in the Caribbean. So I prefer to wear a skin to keep myself from getting stung. All my camera stuff, traveled all over the world with it, so I know what to take. I know what my power and storage needs are. So obviously taking enough memory cards. I travel with 2 portable hard drives to store and back up all my images so that they can't possibly be lost or destroyed. Right. And I back up every day. That's something I would recommend for everybody, no matter where you go, if you're taking a large volume of pictures, because it seems like almost every trip I take, somebody is leaving their images on their camera, on their memory card, because they're not taking that many pictures and their memory card's very big, and one of their kids or somebody else gets a hold of the camera and accidentally deletes everything. I've heard that story so many times. And so that's why I back up my cards every day on 2 different portable hard drives to make sure that they survive. Because for me, the pictures are one of the most important things of the trip. Other than that, really, it wasn't that unusual of a trip to pack for, I didn't think.
And you mentioned the jellyfish. This is like the box jellyfish down in Australia?
Yeah, I've heard of those. I don't think I've ever encountered one, fortunately, since they're supposed to be lethal. But I just, in my own experience, every time I've been in the Pacific or Indian Oceans without a dive skin or a wetsuit, I've always been stung by at least one jellyfish. And it might not have been that severe, but it's uncomfortable.
Enough, yeah.
Whereas in the Caribbean, Florida Keys, someplace like that, I don't find them to be nearly as prevalent. Mm-hmm. And I sunburn easily, so it's important for me to wear a skin anyway. So I just wear a skin, and if the water's not too cold, that's a perfect thing to snorkel in. And this water was not cold at all. It was actually very nice. And wearing a skin is great because it doesn't have any flotation to it, so you can free dive very easily with it on. And I prefer to be able to do that. One of the cuttlefish sightings we had was probably 35 or 40 feet down, and with a wetsuit, you would not get down that far.
Interesting. Most memorable local you met?
I would have to say there was an older man in the village that was the shipbuilding village that I told you about, who was a very colorful character. And he was talking to us through our guide, telling us about sort of the tradition of shipbuilding there. And I would have to say that's the most memorable local that I met. The village is called Wera, W-E-R-A.
Excellent. I've got a few last questions before we wrap it up, though. What else should we know before we follow in your footsteps here, or your sandals, and head down to Indonesia to look at Komodo dragons?
Well, one of the things is think about what city you're going to connect through to get there, because I don't know of any flights that go straight from the United States to Bali. You're going to have to make a connection somewhere. And you've got a choice of several cities to connect through. I think I remember Tokyo, Seoul, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, and Hong Kong being the choices. Maybe there's more, but those are the ones that I remember. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to connect through one of those places, each of which is a great destination in its own right, take the time to plan and stay there for a couple of days. Don't just run yourself through the airport. I stayed in Hong Kong for 2 days and had an absolute great time because I love Hong Kong.
Right.
And
it's a wonderful city.
That's one of the things you can do when you go to that part of Indonesia is think about what you're going to do with your connecting city, because any of them would be a great choice, honestly, for a couple of days to explore.
Well, and that also gave you some time to get over the big hop over the ocean too, which I know will throw, I don't know how you do for jet lag, but that will throw some people off quite a lot.
Oh, sure. My typical experience is if I'm going to go that far, which Bali, as I recall, was exactly 12. It was either 12 or 13 hours off of Eastern U.S. time.
Right.
It takes me a good 2 days to get adjusted on the way out to a trip. So that was really important for me because I'm kind of a wreck for the first couple of days when I go somewhere like that.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm usually fine by the one night's sleep, but not everybody in my group is necessarily feeling the same way.
Right. No, I remember the one of the early trips that I took. I went to South Africa and we were in Johannesburg and taking a day tour of Johannesburg after just having flown 16 hours from Atlanta, making a stop in the Cape Verde Islands. So 2 8-hour segments back to back without getting off the plane. Land in Johannesburg, and I was taking a taxi tour of different important parts of Johannesburg, like Nelson Mandela's home and things like that. And I was falling asleep in the taxi. I couldn't even stay awake because I was so jet lagged from the trip. And that was only an 8-hour time difference.
Yeah, our first 2 days photos when we went to Australia, every picture I think we have is of my son falling asleep. Right. He couldn't stay awake for the first 2 days, I think, too.
Right.
It took him a while to adjust.
Plan a trans-Pacific trip, no matter where in the United States you live, it's a pretty significant time dislocation. Mm-hmm. And giving yourself a day or two to adjust to that on the way out will really enhance your enjoyment of wherever you happen to go, Bali being a perfect example of that.
Right. Well, and I will say with my experience from last January when I flew the ANA flight to Japan, that if you can do that on a lie flat seat, I found that made the adjustment easier than trying to do it in coach, but I usually do that in the back of the plane, so...
I always have too, because I've never been willing to spring for the cost of a first class ticket. Someday maybe I will, but I haven't done it yet.
Exactly. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Indonesia.
I guess only in Indonesia do you see side by side, and I'm speaking of Bali in particular and Denpasar more specifically, only there would you see sort of very traditional old world Hindu temples and architecture side by side with very modern Western stores and restaurants. Like there's a Hard Rock Cafe there and there's all kinds of
sure
Western shopping areas. I would say only in Indonesia and particularly only in Bali would you see that sort of contrast right next to one another.
Excellent. Last two questions. Finish the sentence. You really know you're in Indonesia, or you really know you're off in, what's the island the Komodo dragons are on?
They're on two. Komodo Island is one.
Okay.
We didn't make it there because of the currents. And Rinca, Rinca, is the other one.
And you really know that you're there when what?
Well, when a 9-foot, 200-pound lizard comes lumbering out of the forest. It's honestly the closest thing on Earth there is to a dinosaur. They're roughly that old in the sense that it's a lizard. And to have this big, massive, hulking lizard parting the bushes and coming out of the forest, there is nowhere else to have an experience like that. And it's what really makes going to that part of the world truly unique.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize the whole trip in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
I would call it exotic because I think that the people, the architecture, the scenery were all very exotic, very unfamiliar to people from the United States or people who've traveled to Europe, and even exotic to me. And I've been lots of other places, but it is very exotic in the sense that it's unique in all of its own. The word volcanic comes to mind. They are volcanic islands. You can see active volcanoes and the remnants of active volcanoes literally everywhere you go in that part of the world. So that influence is really always there with you. And you see it in evidence everywhere that you go, from the crater lakes to the active volcanoes to the shipwreck that was rolled off the beach by a volcano, et cetera. So I think volcanic is another key word to me. And then once you get outside of Bali into some of the islands to the east, I think the word that comes to mind is unspoiled. They're very sparsely populated. They're very natural looking. And as I said, the ocean is very unspoiled too, in the sense of the reefs and fish on them. That comes from being in a low population density area, because overfishing is what destroys reefs, one of the things that destroys reefs. And you can tell that's not the case in the areas east of Bali.
Excellent. We'll put a link up in the show notes for those of you who aren't watching the enhanced version of the show that will be off to Chris's pictures as well, and you'll want to take a look at that. But Chris, you still don't have a travel blog, I'm gathering.
No, I don't. I just don't have time to do it.
That is okay. You could just come on here and tell us about your travels. And in fact, rather than Chris has traditionally come on about every year talking about a new trip, but I'm going to persuade him, I believe, to come back on in a month or so and tell us actually about his hometown of Atlanta. So we'll have Chris back on the show again soon. Thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing with us your newfound love for big, long dragons and lizards and for Indonesia.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Chris, and I'll look forward to doing the Atlanta show sometime in the near future with you.
In News of the Community, I had a great question come in this week from Mike, who wrote, I really enjoy listening to your podcasts. I don't get as much opportunity to travel abroad as I would like, so I use your interviews to travel vicariously to places I can only hope to go to one day. My favorite two questions that you ask your guests are, when did they feel furthest from / closest to home? When I travel, I've always considered these questions frequently, as it is great to hear others' thoughts on this. I'm always sorry when I finished a podcast and I have missed those questions due to distraction. I never missed the last three questions, so I wonder if furthest / closest always gets asked. Thank you for letting me armchair travel with the Amateur Traveler. And I wrote back to Michael and said, I don't always ask that question. I sometimes filter it out. I tend not to ask, for instance, if somebody's talking about a place in the U.S. or Canada or Europe, and save that question more for off the beaten path places. I do try and look at the questions in front of me and decide which ones make sense based on what we're talking about and based on what we've already covered. Sometimes I feel that we've already heard the answer to a question, so I won't ask it explicitly. After I sent that to Michael, he had a great response, who said, I first felt that closest to home traveling in Hamburg in the 90s. I looked up and saw nothing but concrete and steel, and I could have been in any large city in the U.S. Conversely, on my trips to the Colorado Plateau, there have been times that I felt like I was back on the outskirts of Kinshasa, DRC. And I understood exactly what Michael was talking about. I did want to give you an update on the trip. I think we are going to do a trip for Amateur Traveler. It's going to be next spring, 2015. And I believe the destination is going to be Morocco. And the tentative date is April. I'm going to be talking to the company that will be guiding that trip this week. So hopefully I'll get some more final details coming up. We also looked at a trip in September, and I don't think that's going to happen. There wasn't quite as much interest. You people plan much further ahead than I do. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, feel free to send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com or leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. Don't forget amateurtraveler.com/credit card if you're looking for a new travel credit card. And you can always follow me on Twitter @Chris2X. If you're on Twitter and you want to send a pre-populated tweet to tell people you like The Amateur Traveler, go to amateurtraveler.com/love. And as always, thanks so much for listening.